Yeah.
I hope everybody's paying attention today because we have a guest calling in from Washington, D.C., and his name is Jay Richards, and he is the director of the DeVos for Life, Religion, and Family Center at the Heritage Foundation. So we want to welcome Jay to the show. How you doing, Jay?
Just fine. Great to be with you.
So diving in, Jay, I see that you're somewhat of a creative. How does the creativity and what you do align in your life?
Well, I suppose I often refer to myself as a shameless generalist. So my academic background is actually most in philosophy and a bit of theology and political science. I think philosophy sort of is like an intellectual Swiss Army knife. If you study the right kind of philosophy, it allows you to apply yourself to different fields. I joke about it, but in some ways my career is what a really focused attention deficit disorder can do, because, a lot of people hear attention deficit disorder and they think, well, that means you're really distracted, but it also means you can focus really intently on things. And so honestly, looking back on my career, I think in some ways I have tried to focus on the things that I think are really, really culturally significant at that moment. And so sometimes that's been a debate about whether there's purpose in the universe or not. At other times, it's a debate about economic freedom versus socialism, or in the present moment, it's this debate over so-called gender ideology, this idea that children can be born in the wrong bodies, and in that case, they should take drugs and surgery to fix it. And so that's at least over the last 3 years what I've been focusing on. But if somebody were to sort of look at my resume or past writings, I might say, gosh, this guy's he's sort of all over the place. But in every case, I'm trying to focus on the things that are sort of the intersection of ideas that I think are really important to culture and to civilization.
I was looking at the Privileged Planet.
Yep.
And when I hear your structure of what you're talking about, it pretty much aligns with somewhat of my spirituality. I have Native American in my family, and I have some natural abilities. I think this is where the rub comes in. How do we get to, for mainstream, talking about spirituality, native world of spirituality, how do we get that to align? Because I think to some extent, there's some missing pieces. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is, at least kind of in the West, there's this perennial question about how faith and reason relate. And at least, say, for a century and a half, kind of Western culture has claimed, well, science and reason contradict the things of the spirit. And in fact, we'll even be told by people like Richard Dawkins that there are no moral truths. Beauty is not a reality. Everything's sort of reducible to blind forces, directing atoms and colliding with each other. That's a particular highly narrow take on what reason is, which I think ends up destroying itself, actually. And so one of the key questions at any moment is, like, how do we integrate the things that we may know that we would think of as spiritual with those things that we know from reason or from studying the physical world or something like that? And I think if we interpret those two things properly, it's fine. I mean, in the Christian tradition, there's this idea that God reveals himself in two books. He creates a world that reveals his existence as creator. It doesn't tell you everything about himself, but then he also has a book of scripture in which he reveals himself more directly and personally. You think in the Old Testament in Exodus, the Hebrews would not have known God's personal name if he had not given Moses his personal name at the moment of the burning bush. And so that's sort of the idea. That's a Christian way of understanding this, that reason and faith, as long as they're properly interpreted, will not conflict with each other, but will either mesh or maybe even mutually reinforce each other.
When you think about that and you think about creation, I mean, people have to realize that something created the uncreated. Is God energy? Is God flesh? Was God energy and was Jesus flesh, the strongest flesh put on earth? And then you look at what's in print, how do we, decipher some of these stories that kind of toe the line of exactly what it is?
Well, of course, there's always the question of how to interpret, either people's claimed private revelations or how, for Christians, how you interpret scripture and other religions' sacred texts. But there are also these kind of philosophical arguments. Like if you're wanting to say, okay, what's the ultimate reality? Whatever is ultimate is going to have to be something that exists on its own. It can't be something that can just pop into existence out of nothing because it needs something else to cause it. Anything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. And so the kind of perennial metaphysical question is, okay, what is the fundamental reality? And there's certain things, it has to always exist. It's got to be the kind of thing that would exist in any possible world. And then it needs to not be dependent on something other than itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't be ultimate. It would be dependent upon something else. And so it's a little abstract, but that would mean that ultimate reality can't be built of parts, because if it's made up of parts, then it could fall apart and the parts are more fundamental than it is. And so that's the kind of sort of perennial thought that at least since the time of Plato, and probably before that, has said, okay, if we're going to talk about the thing on which everything else exists and that exists on its own, it's going to be something like that exists necessarily, that's always existed, and is not based on anything more fundamental than it is. That's really interesting in the 21st century, because for a long time people could say, well, the material universe, maybe it's eternal and it's always existed. We now know that's not true, though. We know from the redshift measurements, we know from the cosmic background radiation, that the universe has not always existed. It has an age. It came into existence in the finite past. So we now live at a moment in which materialism is actually a kind of crummy candidate for ultimate explanation, because the material universe, it began to exist. People don't often realize that. If we talk about the age of the universe, where you think the age is, if it has an age, that means it's not eternal and self-existent. And that's really, really significant, I think, from a spiritual and theological point of view.
Try to align religion, politics, science. We try to align these things, but don't you think sometimes when, I've talked to a lot of very high intellect people, and you talk to the science community, and when you talk to certain people in the science community, they kind of, the way science is written, it kind of keeps everybody in their own lane, and it doesn't let this guy that's over here that may have an attribute, and this guy over here that has an attribute, to use those attributes together. Because when you understand that, just looking at the Newtonian model of reality that we've accepted in society puts us behind the curve, because if we continue to feed off what we see, we continue to create, opinions and controversy instead of being out front. Why do you think we live behind that rule when there's a quantum field over here that we need to understand that may give us some of these answers to some of these religious groups about what creation is?
Well, I do think that the way natural science, has developed, you're right, is that it tends to be highly specialized. So, you mentioned the Newtonian model, but of course, Newton himself was a very broad thinker. People know, of course, he wrote the Principia. He's one of the most significant founders of modern science, and certainly of physics and astronomy. But he actually wrote a heck of a lot of theology. In fact, he probably wrote more on his speculative ideas about biblical prophecy than anyone else. But at the time of Newton, even at the time of Darwin, scientists referred to themselves as natural philosophers. It was not until the mid-19th century, I think it was actually William Whewell that sort of coined the term science, or used the term scientist to refer to this particular kind of study in natural science. But even then, Charles Darwin himself was kind of a gentleman tinker and observer. Now, natural science, if you want to study it, it's highly, highly specialized. So you have to do years of graduate work, and you might be down in some subfield of biochemistry or particle physics. And as you said, you're in part because it's so complex, in part because of the way the training works and the incentives for publishing, they have a lot of incentives to stay very, very narrowly in your lane. And so it ends up falling either to very clever journalists or to philosophers or public thinkers to try to integrate these things. And of course, the devil's always in the details. There are good ways to integrate these things, but there are also bad ways. But that is sort of the dilemma. Science is so hyper specialized that there's a need for well-informed generalists, but that's hard work to know about several different fields well enough to actually be able to integrate them. And it's a tough job. And so I think that's kind of the reality. And then you add to that this unfortunate thing that happened in the 19th century, in which scientists very often came to think of their work as a kind of commitment to materialism, so that science isn't just a study for the evidence of nature, no holds barred, let's follow the evidence where it leads, but it's sort of the best attempt to create the best materialistic explanation for things, which is really a very different thing, and certainly not something that's not where science started, but for many scientists, that's what they think the essence of the practice is.
If you understood discovery compared to creation, do you not think we are in a discovery mindset? Because if you're in a discovery mindset, wherever you may land in that discovery could be light or dark. Hence, Oppenheimer, Einstein. They went through a land of discovery and they landed on something that I don't think God wanted us to do. I don't think God wanted us to split an atom. Why can't we understand the power of what we have?
What's interesting about natural science and the pursuit of science and scientific discovery is that the impression is always that it's a sort of dispassionate weighing of evidence. It's highly mathematical. But if you actually read the testimony of scientists and talk to scientists themselves, what you'll find is that it's actually very often a perception of beauty that guides them. I mean, I know biologists, they go into biology because they love birds. I know astronomers that went into astronomy because they loved the beauty of the stars or the galaxies they could see with small telescopes. And then if you sort of study the history of physics, physicists very often treat the beauty, the kind of the sort of explanatory beauty and the aesthetic qualities of a mathematical formulation is itself a guide to truth. And that's a really, I think, an interesting thing. So that even as a committed scientific materialist who denies that beauty is a real feature of reality, nevertheless depends upon his or her perception of beauty in nature in order to find things that turn out to be true, to predict the world. So I think that scientists, even if they sort of deny the spiritual and the integrated reality of what they are as human beings, they may deny it, but they actually also need to use it to make scientific discoveries. And so I think the perception of beauty is I think, an interesting way of kind of bridging the humanistic parts of science with maybe the mathematical parts.
If you understood where creation started and it's tied to the human body, and it was mathematical per se, if it was mathematical, you could determine what the wrong things have been done through history.
I don't know. I mean, as a Christian, I think God has created a world with extraordinary order and extraordinary beauty, but I don't think everything is determined. I think he's also made, as Thomas Aquinas says, God grants creatures the dignity of causality. In other words, he's created creatures that can themselves create. He creates human beings in his image. We're able to take the world God has created and transform it. And unfortunately, that can be for good or for ill, to create things that were not there before. I think God superintends all those things, but he still gives us freedom. So I don't think what we do is, sort of determined mathematically by the laws of physics or the fine-tuning of the fundamental forces or anything like that.
I just think as a society, we need to grow and be a little more creative and start to understand the quantum field better, because I think that's very limited with what's in print and what's out there explaining it. Like, I think I'm a Christian, grew up in a Baptist church, and I think the stories are the same. I'm just asking these off-the-wall questions of like, how do we get stories to align, But when you take out religious and spiritual things out of institutions, it seems like that's a negative connotation towards spirituality or religion. Why are we seeing some of these definitions and these things happening in society, you think, from your perspective?
I mean, if you sort of look at Western history and certainly American history, I think that there was a general perception at the time of the American founding, in fact, through the 19th century, through the courts, that there's a God, that God can be, that we can know that there's a God by reason, so it's not just a sectarian idea, and that there's a natural law. So there are universal moral principles that apply at all times and places, and if you apply your moral reasoning, you can figure out what those are. And so that was taken for granted, and this is why the founders were perfectly content not to have an established church, at least at the federal level. So that's the point of the First Amendment. But it was not to purge things of the spirit. It was not to purge the idea of a creator of the natural law out of the public square. And in fact, it wasn't even to purge religious practice out of the public square. That's the point of free exercise of religion. The point was simply not to establish a particular confessional, one of the confessions that was common at the time, which would have been mostly Protestant Christianity at the time. What happened, though, maybe in the late 19th century, is a different ideology that we can call progressivism worked its way through our institutions, including the courts, so that now the First Amendment was interpreted to mean that you have to purge every reference to God, you have to purge anything of the spirit or that smacks of religion. Somehow that means you've established religion, and so you can't have any kind of prayer in public schools, for instance. You can't have religious displays in public settings. That's a completely different understanding of the First Amendment. I think it's a kind of secularist overtake of what was previously, I think, a really good compromise in which, okay, we're not going to have a sectarian confessional state, but we're going to have a state that's limited and that presupposes the existence of a creator, presupposes we have our rights because God's created us, and presupposes a more natural moral law in which our laws are based. It's unfortunate that we lost that. I do think the present makeup, at least of the federal courts, we're moving back toward that, slowly but surely moving back, I think, toward that the founding understanding of these things. But it's slow and it's by fits and starts for sure.
With your position and where you're at and what you're doing, what comes from the heart? What are you trying to accomplish personally for your position, for your institution? You work with the Heritage Foundation and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I actually changed my career. Actually, a few years ago, I was teaching in a business school at Catholic University. A great place. Still have lots of good friends there. I'm still an adjunct professor, but I wanted, honestly, to focus on this fight over gender ideology. I had read a book called Irreversible Damage by a woman named Abigail Schreier, talked about gender surgeries in medicine that were being done to teenage girls, mostly in California. And so she kind of broke the story on this pediatric gender medicine. And honestly, I just found it so outrageous and so contrary to what we should actually be wanting for children that I thought, okay, there need to be more people working on this. Heritage and Ryan Anderson, who was here before me, had been working on it. He had written a book on it. And so I when a position came open, I actually applied to Heritage for the position because I wanted to fight this. And I think that we're part of the way there. We've still got a lot of work to do, but I think slowly but surely the courts, certainly the medical organizations outside the United States, and public opinion is moving all in the right direction. But the last thing we should be telling children, especially kids that are uncomfortable with their bodies, is that, oh, well, maybe you're born in the wrong body, and so you just need drugs and surgery to fix that. We want to help children be thankful and love the bodies that God has given them and help them if they're in distress. Help them with that. But you don't help a child who has a misperception of her body by cutting up her body to fit the misperception. You help her with her misconception.
How does that even come to light? I mean, it sounds crazy because I think about when I was a kid and I think about my mindset of sexuality. You're thinking like, okay, do you really know as a young kid? I mean, it just sounds nuts.
It does sound nuts. And I can tell you, I mean, this has been now 3 years I've been talking about this full time, is that people that are, say, Gen Xers or boomers, it sounds crazy to them. They think, okay, we can't really be saying this. We can't be saying that a boy could be a girl just by identifying as a girl. We can't really be saying that the way to help these kids is to give them sterilizing drugs and surgeries. And so half my job initially was to just persuade people that, yes, that's exactly what they're saying and it's exactly what they're doing. There are 79 pediatric gender clinics in this country, and that is what they're doing. We're teaching kids the gender unicorn and the genderbread person to illustrate these ideas, and it's created a massive explosion, a social contagion among the young, in which there's this radical confusion of the body. That's just where we are. At the same time, I think once people realize what's actually being said and what's being done, almost everyone is opposed to it. So half the work is really just helping people understand, okay, this is really happening. Northern European countries, a number of them have put the brakes on these procedures. We're actually we're behind the curve, unfortunately, on that. And we have these massive medical organizations that have continued to push this stuff. I think it will probably continue until there's a massive settlement, legal settlement against one of these gender clinics. And then the malpractice insurance prices for doctors who are doing this will go through the roof and they'll quit doing it. That's a kind of unglamorous way to have something this horrible end. But I do think at least the gender medicine on kids, that is how it's going to end. And in the meantime, those of us in the policy world have spent the last few years working on and supporting bills at the state level, which would at least put the brakes on this stuff temporarily.
How's that even seated? How does that even start for someone actually conceptually think that a gender clinic is a good thing? I mean, where does that come from? Well,
it comes from a really, really confused view of the human person. And so if you think, okay, look, are we intrinsically embodied? Are we created so that our bodies are, doesn't make any sense to be born in the wrong body because my body is part of what I am and who I am. But people get this idea that, well, this kind of purely psychological state, a thing called a gender identity, which if you look up the definition definition, that's an internal sense of gender. That's somehow who we really are. And then our body is just something that might or might not align with that. And so we don't have a sex, we have something they call a sex assigned at birth. So it's something your doctor imposed on you. So in some ways you could think of this as another result of a misunderstanding of freedom. So is our body something that we're given, and it's the way in which we interact with the world, the way we develop virtue, or is a body a prison? Is it another thing that limits our ultimate freedom? So just as we want to be victorious over sickness, we would like to be victorious over the sex of our body. And then in transhumanism, ultimately, you'd like to transcend the body itself, so that you see all these things not as the things that make us who we are, the preconditions for accomplishing what we could accomplish, but as limitations to be overcome. And so that's sort of how it's treated. It's like the body it's a constraint on us. It's a meat suit that we would really like ultimately to be able to discard. That's a very anti-body, and frankly, it's an anti-sex view of things, which is sort of the irony. But it falls sometimes to social conservatives like me and others to actually defend the reality and the goodness of sex, that biological sex is a real description, it's a real part of who we are, and we disregard it at our own peril.
A lot of that, when you have a young community and a young community on social media, it goes back to the technology. When you create choices, when you create a pattern of multiple choices, let's say me and you had, 3 choices 20 years ago. Now that same child or teen or whatever probably has 50 choices. Do you think that pattern creates this kind of okay in society because there's so many choices and everybody wants a category?
Well, yeah, in a sense. I mean, I don't think it's so much because they're benign kinds of choices. I mean, the types of cereal that you get at the grocery store or something like that, or the color of your shoes or something. I think those are mostly benign choices. But if you think, for instance, that your sex, or the popular word now is gender, if your gender is somehow subject to choice, absolutely. I mean, so in some ways, when a small child is being asked, okay, what are your pronouns? The idea is that you sort of choose those, right? It's something that you can actually choose. No, it wouldn't have occurred to anyone to say, what are your pronouns? It's just like, well, if you're a boy, they're he and she. If you're he and him. If you're a girl, it's she and her. That's just what it is. It wouldn't even occur to us that that's something that could be subjected to choice. You're exactly right. I mean, children on social media, first of all, they get used to thinking of themselves as an avatar in which they're already separated from the body, right? They have a kind of virtual self out here that can look however they want it. So they're already kind of getting disembodied in their viewpoint. And then this idea that, in fact, you could be all sorts of things. That's a profoundly destructive idea. I don't think the question is, again, you want to define choice and define freedom properly, because, I mean, there's some things that are simply not subject to your choice. I mean, the fact that I was born on the earth, in fact, any past event, right? They're not subject to our choices. Whether you're male or female, that is not subject to your choice. That's just something that's a reality of what and who you are. And so knowing where that is, things that are subject and should be subject of choice, and those that are not. And then there's, the laws that we have. What laws are is society saying, okay, this is not something that's rightly subject to your choice, whether you're going to unjustly kill someone against their will. That's not shouldn't be subject to your choice. Even if you exercise it, we're going to throw you in jail. That's what civilizations do, though, is make those kind of calls. And I think at the moment, certainly with our young, we're not providing those kind of guardrails for kids precisely the time when they need it.
Well, I say you can find the answers to anything in the foundation. And is there ever discussion about balance between male and female? Because I think society is somewhat taking us the opposite direction when you align male and female. A male should look at a female and be like, all right, she has 5 attributes that I can't do. And the male should be able to look at the female and say, vice versa. Yeah. And then you combine those 5, then you have 10 powerful things as one.
That's right.
I think when you separate that and you create this distance, these pieces in the middle, when it's separated between male and female, these pieces in the middle is where I think some of these things start to happen. When are people going to realize, like, we need to come together as one and understand each other better?
Well, yeah, I mean, the reality of male and female is something, the way I would put it, any just society and any just government recognizes all humans as equal, created in the image of God, equal in dignity and value. So we don't want the law to treat poor poor people differently than rich people or black people differently than white people. We're equal before the law and metaphysically as creatures made in the image of God. At the same time, there are these fundamental differences. And the most important difference is male and female. God has made us. And look, if you're an atheist, you also know this. You know that sexual reproduction is a particular type of reproductive strategy that virtually all plants and animals have, including humans. And what it involves is the fusion of these two differently sized gametes, sperm and egg, with the body plans that go around them. And as you said, if you get one fertile male and one fertile female together, they can create the whole human race. They can mate, all right? They can reproduce, and that's ultimately what sex is about.
So when you talk about the DeVos family, I mean, they're a pretty big family, foundation of Amway Group and so forth. What's it like working with the DeVos?
Well, so Richard and Helen DeVos endowed the center, of which I'm the director at the Heritage Foundation several years. In fact, several years ago, before I was even at Heritage, they were great American philanthropists. Richard DeVos was a co-founder, of course, of the Amway Corporation. They're from West Michigan. Just amazing philanthropists that certainly they funded the Heritage Foundation and many, many worthy organizations. The foundation actually sunsetted itself here this spring, which just basically means a philanthropist can set up a foundation. And so the way foundations work is they usually spend the interest every year on the principal, but they retain the principal balance so they can do this in perpetuity. But some philanthropists say, I don't know what's going to happen 50 years from now and who will be running my foundation. I think we'll spend down the money sooner than that. And so that's what they did. And so that's called sunsetting, in which you spend down the principal. And the foundation actually has just done that. So the DeVos, the children and grandchildren have their own foundations.
Get into it or not, what's your thoughts about the current climate with the actions this past week in our political system? Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think certainly a couple of weeks ago now, the debate between President Biden and former President Trump it's an historic event. Look, we're here in Washington, D.C. It's been known for years that President Biden was suffering from some form of dementia. It's just widely known, but the media has done a very good job of covering that up. And then suddenly it was just that fact was available to absolutely everyone all at once. And so that was hugely consequential. And then, of course, the attempted assassination of President Trump here. That doesn't happen very often. In fact, in my lifetime, my age, the only president that, there was a near assassination attempt was, of course, President Reagan in 1981, which is also unsuccessful. We're all very thankful that the bullet mysteriously, perhaps miraculously, only just, hit his ear and didn't kill him or hit him in the temple or in the back of the head, because I think that would have been catastrophic, not just for sort of Republicans, but for the country and maybe the world as a whole. I mean, I hope that it will be an opportunity for everyone, wherever they are on the political spectrum, to say, okay, look, it makes sense that we argue over these things and we have debates over elections, and we can feel really strongly about those things, but we want to settle these things at the ballot box and not with bullets. That's what makes a successful republic, is the ability to transfer power peacefully, even if we're slugging it out over ideas. Let's remember that these are arguments over policies and ideas, and we shouldn't think that the solution to these things is to try to kill people. That's a catastrophe. That, unfortunately, is how most political systems have worked throughout history, and it is absolutely not something that we should want for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw it, I think I started crying. I mean, it's like if you don't see, the reality in front of us, and if people as human beings don't see that, hey, why are we here? We got to get better. I think there's something wrong with you. You got to get better. We got to get better as a group. I mean, it's not about, Democrats or Republicans. I think we just have to get better as humans and understand and appreciate life more.
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say that the footage I've seen of President Trump after this, he himself looks different. I do think that you often hear that when people come very close to death, it often gives them a new perspective that they haven't had before. And so I hope and I pray that for him, that it will strengthen him and give him a good perspective, and then give us all a new perspective on these things.
Well, if we want to find Jay Richards, find out what you're doing in tackling this gender issue in the country, where do we find you?
You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Dr. Jay Richards, so just DrJay Richards. And you can certainly find me in articles by other colleagues at the Heritage Foundation at heritage.org.
I think it's been a great conversation. Hopefully people have learned something from this conversation today. This has been Dr. Jay Richards, and I am John Edmonds Kozma, the CEO of Bang Productions. Thank you.